At the beginning of the semester, we introduced a concept called epistemology, which is the study of knowing how we know. How do we know that cognitive behavioral therapy reduces depression more than other forms of therapy, or compared to doing nothing? So these ways of knowing have been peppered throughout the course, and we've been really focusing on the quantitative kinds of questions around knowing, and we've been calling them things like threats to internal validity and reliability, and we will talk in subsequent weeks on statistical inferences. But this week we're going to really drill down on this concept of qualitative studies. Qualitative studies are distinct from quantitative studies in a number of ways. For example, in quantitative studies, we can prescribe numbers to things like depression, which tell us something about it. We can measure depression, as we talked about last week, using composite indicators. So I can ask you about the number of symptoms you have. Do you have depressed mood? Do you have loss of interest? Are you having sleep problems, appetite problems, etc., etc.? And I can count up how many of those you have, and I can assign a number to you. You have 5, and 5 means that you have a diagnosis of depression, versus 4, which means you don't have a diagnosis of depression. But not all questions are amenable to describing with numbers. Sometimes we want to hear in a person's own voice what they're going through, what they're experiencing, and we want to honor their particular way of talking about it, their particular way of describing it, and we don't want to reduce it to a set of numbers. And for questions like these, quantitative methods that spend time with individuals or with cultures or with periods of time or people, whatever our unit of study is, allow us to get a very in-depth perspective on things. The epistemological question of can we understand reality, can we really get into it, from a quantitative perspective is answered yes. There is an objective reality that we can tap into. Depression is something, and I can measure that depression through a set of indicators like we just described. Qualitative perspectives say the world is subjective in many respects, and this subjectivity can only be explored by talking in depth with individuals, and that subjectivity isn't necessarily shared across all individuals. It isn't necessarily something that can be generalized to the entire population. Sometimes a lot of the things we experience are personal, and those are our personal stories. And so while we can talk about depression in the sense of a number of symptoms, there are also personal stories of depression, how depression affects the lived experience of somebody, the tales of what it's like to be in depth in someone's in a depressed state. So Winston Churchill had a name for his depression. He called it the big black dog. And so for him, there was this clear metaphor that explained and provided meaning and description for this experience that he had. Now, the big black dog is not an indicator that fits into a quantitative perspective, but it's a metaphor that's very useful for us to understand. And in order to tap into these subjective personal experiences, we need to use qualitative methods rather than quantitative methods. And there's lots of things that we as social workers are interested in that require the use of these in-depth understandings of subjective experience that can be tapped in through qualitative methodologies. In addition to the difference between objective, and which are quantitative, and interpretive or subjective, which are qualitative, there's a slightly different way of thinking about the world from a qualitative perspective than a quantitative perspective, and this is characterized by the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. Deductive thinking starts with the big picture, and this is the quantitative approach that we've been really working systematically through for the whole semester. We start with a theory. We then develop hypotheses based on that theory. We then observe things, and then we make statements about the validity of our hypothesis, and that then reflects back to the theory. So we start with the big picture and we move toward the narrow picture, and that sort of upside down triangle is what deductive thinking is, and that's the perspective taken from quantitative research. We have a hypothesis, we develop a specific set of tests of that hypothesis, and then we measure things through the use of our quantitative methods. Instead of an upside down triangle, if we think of a right side up triangle, that is inductive reasoning, where we start open to experience and we begin to ask questions. And through that process of questions, we develop a set of understandings, and then we compile those understandings and the patterns of those understandings into a set of hypotheses and then theories. So instead of starting with a theory and moving down to a understanding, to the development of a set of patterns, we start with asking questions and being open to experience and move into a theory. This process of inductive reasoning is the approach taken in, for the most part, in qualitative studies. When are qualitative methods appropriate and when are quantitative methods appropriate? If we are asking questions of effectiveness, does treatment A work better than treatment B? That requires a quantitative approach. If I want to understand how many people in the population suffer from alcoholism, that's obviously a quantitative question. I want to count people in a population. If I want to understand the risks associated with poverty on healthcare utilization or rates of obesity or anything where I'm trying to figure out, is there more of this in this group than in that group? These are quantitative questions. But sometimes I want to understand what it's like to be poor, what it's like to go hungry. I want to understand the lived experience of somebody working on minimum wage. I want to get into a particular culture and understand how they see a problem. If I want to understand why people aren't coming to my clinic, that requires an approach that involves being open to people, this inductive process, listening to what they have to say, and then developing some ideas based on their language, their description of why they didn't come back to the clinic. Let's take a simple question. How many people are coming back to my clinic? How many people are not showing up for appointments? And why? Well, there's two different questions there. One is a counting question. Who's coming back? How often do they come back? Who's not coming back? These are quantitative questions. On the other hand, understanding why people aren't coming back. What is it that happened at the clinic that caused them not to want to come back for our services? These are qualitative questions. There are a whole host of questions that aren't quantitative, that can't be reduced to numbers. And those are a good place to start with qualitative methods. Sometimes we want to explore things that we don't really understand, so we don't even know how to measure them yet. So we want to understand the experience using these inductive methods to build a theory that we can then test quantitatively, but we need to start with qualitative. Sometimes things just aren't quantitative. They're just not quantifiable. Churchill's black dog is something that you don't want to quantify. You want to think about it as his statement. You want to think about the metaphor. It's the way he described it that is of value, not the fact that this constitutes some sort of symptom that can be counted. Some things are sensitive or hidden and are difficult to access through surveys or other methodologies. Sometimes the population that we want to study is too small and it's just not that useful to use quantitative approaches. So there's a whole host of reasons why we would want to use qualitative rather than quantitative methods. But I don't want to set up the difference between qualitative and quantitative as being in conflict. They're in fact often complementary. So I believe I've described before in the video series some of my research around heroin, and we have two teams. We have a quantitative team and a qualitative team, and we are constantly in communication working back and forth. These are called mixed methods. So while I handle a lot of the quantitative data, and we might ask questions about who's going to the hospital for opiate overdoses or heroin overdoses, if we want to understand what's happening on the ground with people, what is changing in people's lives that are leading them to take more risky behavior, I can't answer that with the hospital data. The hospital data only tells me a lot more young people are having heroin overdoses now than was happening 20 years ago. But why is that happening? Because knowing that it's happening is not the end of the question. That why question is something that we only can find out by going and talking to folks. And from our research, it looks like these young folks are getting access to a lot of prescription opiates, Vicodin, OxyContin, those kinds of things, and are using them at a much higher rate than previous generations. And so the young folks are being indoctrinated into opiate use, which then transitions to heroin use. And so we can hypothesize that with the quantitative data, but we can only know it and find out about it by directly asking people about what their pathway in to heroin use is. And so that's a very good example of how the interaction between quantitative and qualitative methodologies can produce a better understanding, because quantitative is really good at counting, whereas qualitative is really good at understanding things in depth. And then combined together, we can then have a sense that this is happening in the population and better understand why it's happening in the population.